The age of discovery and exploration. Europe expands its horizons. In the 14 and 1500s, European countries began exploring and expanding their boundaries beyond the continent of Europe. They had several motives for doing so. First, Ottoman control of the land routes to Asia encouraged Europeans to search for water routes to Asian spices and markets. Second, there was the desire to spread Christianity. Finally, there was a desire for personal glory. You can sum up the motives for many European countries as God, gold, and glory. The Portuguese were the first European nation in the 1400s to begin exploring and expanding. Under Prince Henry the Navigator, a Portuguese prince who established an academy for navigation in 1420, the Portuguese became the premier exploration and sailing country in Europe. A Portuguese explorer named Bartolomeu Dias reached the southern tip of Africa in 1488, an area now known as the Cape of Good Hope. We see Prince Henry on the left and Bartolomeu Dias on the right. This map shows the route that Dias took. He originally wanted to call the southern tip of Africa the Cape of Storms, for the terrible storms that he encountered there, but the King of Portugal changed it to the more marketable Cape of Good Hope. Another Portuguese explorer named Vasco da Gama sailed all the way around Africa and reached India in 1498. The value of the cargo he brought back was worth 60 times what the voyage had cost. The Portuguese set out to take control of the spice trade in Southeast Asia from Muslim merchants. To do so, Portugal took control of the island of Malacca in Southeast Asia and used it as a base of operations to control the spice trade. This map shows all the areas, land and sea, controlled by the Portuguese by the late 1400s. Other explorers soon followed in the wake of the Portuguese. Christopher Columbus, an Italian explorer who sailed for Spain, tried to sail west in 1492 in an effort to reach the Indies, a group of islands off the coast of India. Instead, he ended up arriving in the Bahamas in the Caribbean, just off of the coast of North America.
We're probably connected to another printer, but Susan will let us know. Okay. Yeah, she heard. It went to Amber.
Okay, thank you. As Spain and Portugal raced to take control of as much territory as possible, they turned to the Pope in 1494 to create a line of demarcation, a line of... Here you can see the lines created by the Treaty of Tordesillas and the later Treaty of Zaragoza. The Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494 divided the world between the Spanish and the Portuguese. The Portuguese got control of their water route around Africa to Asia, while Spain got most of the then unknown to Europeans New World of North America and South America. Other explorers began sailing west and exploring the coasts of these new continents. John Cabot was an Italian sailor who explored the coastline of the northeastern part of North America for the English. Amerigo Vespucci was an Italian cartographer or map maker who charted the coastline of South America and was one of the first to recognize that South America was a separate continent from Asia. The continents of North and South America are named for Vespucci. Here we see Amerigo Vespucci's map of the known world, which portrayed the coastlines he saw and knew relatively accurately, even if he wasn't aware of quite how large the continents of North and South America actually were. North and South America are seen here on the left. As the Spanish began exploring, they sent out conquistadors, conquerors in the New World. Several of these conquistadors were quite important, such as Hernan Cortez, the conquistador who conquered the Aztecs in Mexico in 1519. Another conquistador, Francisco Pizarro, conquered the Incas in Peru in On the top left, we see Cortez encountering the Aztecs in Mexico. In the bottom right, we see Francisco Pizarro. Spanish colonists were granted something called encomienda, which was the right to demand taxes and labor from the local Native Americans. Encomienda was essentially a system of slavery. The Spanish were successful in their conquest and colonization of the New World for several reasons. First, the Spanish had powerful weapons, such as guns and cannons, while the Native Americans they fought were fighting mostly with bow and arrow. Second, the Spanish formed alliances with other tribes. The Aztecs, for instance, had conquered many of the surrounding tribes, and those tribes were more than willing to work with Cortez and the Spanish to overthrow the Aztec rule. Third, the Spanish had horses, which allowed them to move faster than the natives. Finally, the Spanish brought with them diseases such as smallpox. The Spanish conquistadors were immune to these diseases, but the local natives were not. We saw the native populations of many areas in the New World drop considerably after the Spanish arrival. The population of Hispaniola, for instance, dropped from 250,000 in the years prior to Columbus's arrival to only 500 by the year of 1538. The population of Mexico dropped from 25 million in 1519, the year Cortez conquered the Aztecs, to only about 10 million. Ferdinand Magellan was a Portuguese explorer who attempted to circumnavigate, or sail all the way around the world for Spain. Magellan himself died in the Philippines, but 18 members of his 230-member crew managed to make it all the way around the world and back to Spain. And though Magellan himself died in battle in the Philippines, a handful of his crew managed to make it back to Spain 3 years after they initially set out. The Netherlands established 2 companies to manage their colonization and exploration efforts. The first, the East India Company, was a Dutch company formed to compete with the Portuguese and the English in India for the spice trade. The second, the West India Company, was a Dutch company formed to compete with the Portuguese and the Spanish in the New World. They established a colony called New Netherland, in present-day New York, in the 16th. A colony is any settlement of people living in a new territory linked with a parent country by trade and direct government control. The Spanish, Portuguese, Dutch, English, and French all established colonies in the New World and around Asia in the 15 and 1600s. They were practicing mercantilism, an economic system in which the prosperity of a nation depends on a large supply of gold and silver, usually acquired through the control of colonies. Mercantilism relied on a balance of trade, the difference in value between what a nation imports or brings in and what a nation exports or sends out. A favorable balance of trade for the home country has more valuable exports than imports. In the New World, many colonists established plantations, large agricultural or farming estates. Plantations need lots of laborers, so European colonists started using slaves. Originally, the Spanish used the local Native American population through the process of encomienda, but eventually they began to import slaves from Africa. Europeans established a pattern of trade called triangular trade that connected Europe, Africa, and the New World. Finished goods produced in Europe were taken to Africa, where they were exchanged for slaves. Slaves and finished goods were then taken to the New World, where they were exchanged for raw materials such as lumber, fish, and sugar. Raw materials were then taken back to Europe, where they were turned into finished goods, and the process began all over again. This map details the method of triangular trade and the routes taken. Part of triangular trade was the Middle Passage, the voyage across the Atlantic that took slaves from their home in Africa to the New World. thousands of slaves died from malnutrition and disease on the Middle Passage. Most African slaves were purchased from local African merchants at slave markets. They would buy prisoners of war from other tribes or kidnap people to be slaves. Slaves were packed very tightly into ships for the Middle Passage, often even stacked on top of one another in the holds. Thousands of slaves died en route to the Americas. The slave trade had several effects on the population of Africa. First, it increased warfare among African tribes. Second, it changed the political landscape of Africa, destabilizing some nations and making others stronger. Population of Africa by several million. Fourth, the disappearance of entire nations led to the loss of African cultures. Fifth, the slave trade shifted trade routes in Africa towards the coasts and away from the inland routes. Finally, to some extent, it changed the religious beliefs of Africans. Though Islam remained the primary religion of North Africa, Christianity makes some inroads in the area. Mainland Southeast Asia was very stable in the 1500s. The Malay Peninsula, at the tip of Southeast Asia, was less stable. Muslim merchants took control of the spice. Dutch traders took over much of the Portuguese spice trade in Southeast Asia in the 1600s. The Dutch were better funded and more powerful than the Portuguese. This map shows areas controlled by the Dutch East India Company in pink, as well as several other major nations in the area. The Dutch merchants established limited relations with the mainland states, or the kingdoms on the Asian continent, but were mostly kept out by the stable political systems that already existed there.